They attempted to limit cues by which speakers could make a judgment to stress â and ò, wanting to find out whether participants could identify speakers on the basis of these two vowels. They used very short sentences spoken by an African-American male speaker not from Philadelphia. The samples were digitized and underwent LPC analysis, estimating bandwidths and locations of F1 through F4. They then artificially raised F2 so that the vowel nuclei were fronted. Listeners were asked to rate what they heard on a scale of 1, quote, sounds very black, to 7, sounds very white, and to make a judgment about whether the speaker was African American or white. These are separate judgments, and the second was necessitated by the inclusion of the speakers who tried to talk like the other ethnicity. The results showed not only that fronted â was judged by the participants to, quote, sound white, but that the sound was perceived by most as something that would not be produced by an African American at all. Fronted â was judged by both African American and white participants as more white, by more than a 3-to-1 margin over sounding more black. O, on the other hand, was judged as sounding white, though by a less overwhelming margin. But surprisingly, the African American listeners rated the actual identity of the artificially O-fronting speaker as African American, even though they had rated that speaker as sounding more white. In other words, they thought the O-fronter was an African American trying to sound white, not someone who actually was white. So O-fronting, at least among African Americans in Philadelphia, is not only salient in defining whiteness, but also salient in trying to fake whiteness. The graph above Harris' article is also important because it shows that the salience of individual variable features may be tested using acoustic analysis. This eliminates a potential pitfall in measuring people's perceptions. Asking people what their perceptions are about their own dialect can be terribly inaccurate, as the metalinguistic knowledge of a layperson sometimes lacks. Thomas and Reeser went a step further in the empirical measurement of salience because they came closer to truly isolating the variables for which they were testing salience. They extracted 2 samples apiece from 18 Hyde County, North Carolina speakers, 12 African American, 6 white, 1 sample with fronted O, and back raised oi, and 1 without. There's also a control group of 6 inland North Carolina speakers. Hyde County is characterized by a sharp ethnic divide socially. Linguistically, the older African Americans align with whites much more closely than the younger African Americans do, who pattern somewhat closer with urban AVE nationwide. Thus, a perception test would hold significant potential for confusion of the ethnicity of elderly African Americans in particular. They digitized samples on KCSL and played them in one of 3 manners: unaltered, synthetically monotonized, and having been low-pass filtered. The monotonized version eliminated fundamental frequency variation, and the low-pass filtered version eliminated segmental information insofar as possible. Their findings were consonant with expectation. First, the Hyde County African Americans were identified correctly much less often than were the Hyde County white speakers, or the control group. For those African American speakers, passages that featured Pamlico sound vowel variants showed poor accuracy on the part of the listeners, which might indicate that the fronted O was misleading them. Regression analyses showed that presence versus absence of diagnostic vowels was the only variable that achieved statistical significance for the unmodified passages. Furthermore, elderly Hyde African Americans were identified the least reliably, probably because they had the most of those Pamlico sound vowel variants than their younger counterparts. So following this previous research, methodology summaries for my perception tests appear in numbers 3A through 3C and 4 in your handout. In order to determine if O, pre-voiceless I, and U socially mark not only ethnicity but also speaker's region, I conducted perception tests with students in introductory linguistics classes at NC State and Duke. None had ever taken a class in language variation. All but 1 were native speakers of English, and none reported hearing impairment. And the perception test at State, I played very short frames for the participants in which a speaker pronounced the vowel in question clearly and in a stressed environment, avoiding liquids and nasals. The participants were asked to make an ethnicity judgment and to rate the speakers on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being most Southern. The speakers are all from the library of the North Carolina Language and Life Project from various locales in North Carolina, Ohio, Minnesota, and Texas. Their ethnicity and region appear in number 5A through 5C in your handout. The samples were limited to 1 to 3 words, just enough to allow the speech to sound somewhat natural to the participants, since one sound samples can sound very unnatural when they're clipped. The samples were chosen so that the key vowel would be prominent in every frame, surrounded mostly by schwa and other syllables. No diagnostic morphosyntactic variables were included. The samples were played in analog format. So based on those methods from Thomas and Reeser and Goskins, the samples were played for participants in one of 3 manners: unmodified, synthetically monotonized, and low-pass filtered at 300 hertz, so as to eliminate segmental variation. Goskins calls this prosody only. The samples were recorded onto a tape, repeated thrice each with short breaks in between, and the order was randomized within each treatment group. The order of the treatment groups was unmodified, then monotonized, and low-pass filtered last. The results of the O ethnicity perceptions offered by the participants appear in 6A through 6B on your handout, separated by acoustic treatment group. In 6A, you can see the unmodified stimuli provoked correct ethnicity judgments about 63% of the time overall, but while the O backers fell in the middle, the O fronters were identified as white over 80% of the time, and the African American O fronter is misidentified 84% of the time as white, 30 of 38 participants. In 6C, the overall success rate on the low-pass filtered O stimuli drops below 48%, suggesting the speakers need the segmental information, like the O nucleus, to guess correctly. A chi-square test correlating the status of the O nucleus with perceived whiteness appears in 7. Within a single degree of freedom, the chi-square is very high for the unaltered data and even high for the monotonized at p is less than 0.001. Region perceptions for O appear in 8. The respondents aren't terribly good at picking out segments from what they've been given. Most notably, the O backers get perceived as more southern than the O fronters, though the numeric differences are very slight. Monotonizing and low-pass filtering mute the differences even more. So from these data, I cannot argue that fronted O is indicative of region for the respondents of the perception test. Not surprisingly, given what we've been hearing from LaBeouf and Fagan, other colleagues today, pre-voiceless I presents us with a different picture, since it's such a marker of the South.